Welcome to Let's Talk Democracy. I'm Tina Johnson, your host. Join me as we talk to the people on the front lines, the change makers and activists who are building a stronger, healthier democracy for all of us. Whether you're looking for expert advice, a new perspective, or just a little inspiration, this is where you'll find it. Most people feel like their voice in government doesn't really matter. You vote, and then decisions get made without you. But what if there was a way to weigh in on legislation in real time, securely, digitally, and at scale? Today, we're talking about digital democracy and whether technology can actually fix a broken system or if it will make it worse. In today's episode, Can Technology Fix Democracy? I am joined by Ramon Perez, founder of the Digital Democracy Project. Together, we explore a bold question. What if democracy didn't stop at the ballot box? Ramon is building a platform that allows everyday citizens to weigh in on legislation as it's happening, not just every few years during elections, but continuously, using tools like mobile voting, blockchain, and AI. His work is focused on making democratic participation more accessible, transparent, and accountable. In our conversation, we unpack how this technology works, what it means for representation, and the challenges of making sure all voices, not just the loudest or most organized, are heard. If you've ever wondered whether democracy can evolve into something more participatory and responsive, this conversation is for you. Let's get into it. Hi, Ramon. Thank you for joining me today and welcome to the podcast. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Tina. I appreciate being on.
This season's focus is on democracy from a social media, digital platform perspective. The work that you're doing, in particular around digital democracy, was very interesting to me. And so I thought this would be a really good conversation to have with someone who's thinking through ways to engage voters through using a digital platform that focuses on engagement, specifically around legislation. And so I wanted to start our conversation by asking you the question on how did you decide to do that?
Yeah, I have been working in the AI and machine learning space for about a dozen years, and through as a technology consultant. So I got connected to a lot of people working in things like blockchain and biometrics and mobile authentication and cryptography and things like that. And I got connected to the CEO of Votes, that's VOATZ, which is the partner technology that we're using. And they build mobile voting software for military voters overseas to cast a ballot, an absentee ballot from their phones in a secure way. So it's built on blockchain and it uses end-to-end verifiability and homomorphic encryption and all this stuff. I was actually in the military myself, so I immediately resonated with that particular problem because if you're overseas and you're trying to vote absentee, it's actually quite challenging to do it, and to do it, especially if you're in a place where it's tough to get mail in and out. So if you're in a submarine under the water for 6 months or whatever, it's tough to get an absentee ballot out. So I immediately understood what they were trying to do, but it said, if you can verify that somebody is a U.S. citizen and that person is registered to vote and they're on the voter file and they've got a photo ID that matches their face, and you can do the face biometrics, the face ID like on your iPhone or the touch ID on your iPhone, things like that. If you could do all of that and then put their votes onto a blockchain to make sure that the vote that's cast is the vote that's counted, well, that really revolutionizes the process in a way that allows us to reimagine democracy as a more active system, right? Right? Why should we have to wait every couple of years to have a say in our government? Why don't we build something like the Netflix of government, government on demand, where people can engage with their government all the time using this technology and do it in a secure, verifiable way? So we kind of sketched that out in 2021, started building, went into beta testing in 2022, and then did the first live legislative session in Florida in 2023. And the idea is that we're not asking people to vote like using you know, even though votes has been used in real binding elections, so about 5 million votes cast at this point, but we are loading legislation that is being actively debated in the Capitol. We started this in Florida, so we're talking state legislation, and we let people weigh in on that legislation as it's being debated, and then we provide the results in real time to legislators so they can see what their districts want, because we validate people against the voter file that we get from the state, because we are a 501(c)(3) nonprofit. So it gives us access to voter files because we do, this type of work. So we can validate people against a voter file. We know which districts they're in. We know that they're real human beings. We do a selfie scan that matches against their photo ID and all the two-factor authentication and all that. But the idea is that the legislators can see what their voters want in real time while they're taking a tough vote in the Capitol, and the voters have a say in the process. And at the end of every legislative session, we match what did the voters in the app want and how did the legislators actually perform? How did they vote on the same bills? So every legislator gets a scorecard which shows how closely do they match the will of the people in their districts.
Something that I am curious about is how many people actually engage in the platform to have their voices be heard, how they don't become the only voice that is being heard by the politicians on legislation
Right.
when there's so many other people that might weigh in, but maybe their preference is to go through an amendment process on a ballot, or to go to a
Mhm.
town hall meeting, or to use the telephone, or to write a letter. How do those voices also have the same leverage and the same
Mhm.
impact?
Right. We have to do two things at once. We have to verify people. So there is a high barrier to entry in the sense that it's not like just jumping on Twitter with an anonymous account and, having a conversation, right? But because we know that um, there's so much fake content generation. And this is the same way for legislators. They do get a lot of emails, they do get a lot of phone calls. The email inboxes are actually so overloaded with kind of form filled letters that are very standardized. So, you go to change.org, you file a petition, or you go to a lot of these different websites, you can fill out a form and it'll send it to your legislator. But legislators, for the most part, ignore that because they cannot validate that this is a real person and that that person lives in their district. So, for the most part, it goes into a spam filter. And I can say that from firsthand experience because I've been in a lot of their offices and watched how they do this. And it's actually way less technologically sophisticated than you would think. It's literally Gmail filters like you would use in your inbox. And they kind of use a heuristic to say, okay, well, X number of people have filled up this filter on housing policy. Well, maybe housing policy is important to people, right? So they'll do that, some simple heuristics, but they, for the most part, are not going to look at every message or necessarily believe that every message is real. The other issue is that we have now a lot of AI generated content. So there is a system in Arizona where you can register your position on a bill, and that has um, now being AI generated or generated by bots. Like so, in the past, organizations would go and put down the name of their organization, say we're taking a stance on this particular bill, pro or con, or individuals could do it, and then you were supposed to provide, your address or some basic information to show that you're actually a resident of Arizona. And we're because now we're doing work in Arizona, we're hearing from people who have had their names show up on that list when they never actually put their names down themselves, whether it was an organization or an individual. So we're seeing now some AI generated names being put down to try to influence legislators one way or the other to do a thing, right? To do something on a bill. So we are attempting to make a system that legislators can rely upon to actually provide input that will replace the current system of sending an email, writing a letter, calling the switchboard, putting something on the message board. That is our intention, that we can provide a system that gives the veracity that legislators need, but at the same time gives the agency that voters demand, because voters want a say in this process and they expect to be heard and they deserve to be heard. And we want them to be able to hold legislators accountable to say, okay, if I have to go through this high barrier, if I have to take a scan of my face and show my passport or my driver's license, and I have to like look at all these bills and weigh in. What do I get in return? Well, what I get is I get that scorecard that says this is what our community asked for, and this is what you actually did. So, come election time, we can decide if you're a good representative of this district or if you need to be replaced with somebody else.
Yeah, but I think that it still leaves the question for me, how does this not create, a divide within communities that aren't in agreement on legislation? If you are smart enough or organized enough to gather your group of friends who are like-minded on an issue and say, "Here's a platform where we know our legislators are actually looking for information, are looking for the voice of the constituents to say we're putting forward the bill that the people that we've heard from want." How do you prevent that from being a one-sided how do you prevent that from just being one part of the community instead of it being representative of the entire community? Is there some way in which that outreach is done so that
Yeah.
everyone in the community has access and knows, hey, this is available for you to engage with and for you to be able to influence directly legislation and policy that is important to your communities?
We've verified about 24,000 people so far, and a lot of that has come through community organizations, not directly from us. We're a nonprofit. We're an all volunteer team. We don't spend money on marketing or advertising or anything like that. We work with other organizations. So, the League of Women Voters, for example, has been an amazing group, and they've done a lot of educational sessions where they've had us come and speak about the platform and show people how they can use it and get engaged. Other groups are advocacy groups where they take a position. Let's say it's Citizens Climate Lobby, for example, cares about climate, and they will let the people in their groups and their newsletter and their social media feeds know that a climate bill is coming up, and they can have a say on that bill using Digital Democracy Project, um, that kind of thing. So a lot of the outreach has been from issues-based organizations that push the platform amongst their own network. And so they are already engaging their communities. Our goal is to make sure that we are um, communicating with sort of the political uh, every side of the political discussion, so that we're having conversations with conservative aligned groups and progressive aligned groups and independent groups and variety of both sides of an issue group, let's say. So the Chamber of Commerce, for example, might take one side and on taxes or whatever, and then progressive organizations might take the other side. One of the things that we're doing is as well is allowing these groups to state their point of view or take a position on a bill on digital democracy projects. So if you take a look at a bill, you can actually pull up which organizations have made a public position. And I think individuals like to see, which groups are supporting or opposing, so that they can get some sense of if they individually are aligned with some of these groups, they'll know, which side should I take on this particular bill. I think what we're trying to do is lower the barrier to entry by providing as much information as we can. That means that anybody can participate. All you need is to be a registered voter, and you need to be able to and you do need to have a photo ID, because we do need to validate that you're a real human being. But otherwise, we don't make any restrictions so that anybody in any community can participate, and that the outreach happens through their networks that they're sort of already accustomed to working with. So that way, they're already hearing from their local community organizers in that sense. The other thing too is that I would expect that the kind of people who engage on public policy are already the same kind of people the people who would come to our platform are the same kind of people who would call a legislator's office or send them an email. So you're already talking about a smaller slice of the electorate that tends to be more highly engaged, at least on a specific issue. So you may have the super voter types who engage on everything, right? They want to read every bill and vote on every bill. We do have those people because they love public policy. They want to express their point of view. But most people are animated by a single policy. So they may only care about guns. They may only care about taxes. They may only care about environment or abortion rights or whatever the case. So those folks will jump into the system, maybe vote on one bill or vote on one topic area, and then leave. And we want to be able to support everybody for those reasons, right? Because whether you're here for one single bill or you're here as because you believe in participatory democracy, it's up to for our point of view. We just want to provide a platform where people can express themselves and have some greater agency and sense of participation in the process and accountability over the results.
I know that we've talked before, and you've mentioned that one of the reasons that you decided to create this platform is because of January 6th, after Biden was elected president and Donald Trump encouraged his supporters to storm the Capitol. And I'm wondering how those people who who took part of that connect to the platform's idea of giving people a voice and an opportunity. Because if I the way I understood it, and you can clarify and also explain it better if I'm not doing it justice, is that the feeling that people have that they're not connected to government
Right. Right.
feeds this sense of angst, anger, and destruction that we need to do something so dramatic like storm the Capitol and do these violent acts in order to be heard. And as
Right.
a result of that, this platform is meant to do that. And yet, if it's going through organizations and they're doing the outreach, is it necessarily reaching those people who feel marginalized um,
Right.
by
Right.
the current system, as well as groups that are marginalized by the current system and the way that it works?
Right. I think that's a good point. And my worry was that it's very clear that we have structural problems in our democratic system that intentionally carve people out of the process. And in my mind, the smoking gun is gerrymandering, the way we draw all the district boundaries so that a safe blue or safe red seat means that a legislator literally has no incentive to listen to the people outside of a highly animated progressive or conservative base of supporters, which means that, the 8 to 10% of people who vote in a primary get all the attention and the other 90% get ignored. And so I think people who don't have a really good sense of how the system works, all they see is the effect of that, which is a government that no longer listens to them. They can feel that. The animus is real because it's based on a real structural deficiency. So my worry is that if you don't solve that problem, if you don't fix the underlying issues, you're going to get more violence. You're going to get more people storming the Capitol because they feel like they don't have any agency in the process. It's the equivalent when we saw anarchist groups take over Portland during the Black Lives Matter protests. And those were, I guess you could call them, I don't know if you would call them left wing groups or whatever. Maybe they weren't, but they were more anarchist groups. But they basically pushed the city government out and took control of downtown Portland and ran it almost like a scene from Mad Max. And I think it was, to me, it's an equivalent sense of frustration that people have that they have no say in the government that is meant to represent them. Portland, at least to their credit, has gone through an entire rewriting of the city charter and has introduced ranked choice voting and multi-member districts and all sorts of reforms that have been fantastic. They've had a lot of really good positive response come out of that. And I think the United States government needs to learn by that example, which is like acknowledge the problem is real and find fundamental ways to make the system more accountable to the people, more democratic. So the answer is not retreating from democracy. The answer is giving greater voice and agency in a more democratic process. And so that to me was a big motivation. I do understand the point you're making, which is like people need, if it's going through organizations that already have some access to power because they're accustomed to organizing around issues, then do these marginalized groups still get ignored? And I think my hope in this process is that we can scale so that we go from, 24,000 verified voters to 240,000 verified voters to, 24 million verified voters to 240 million verified voters. And the platform is available to everybody and it's so completely ubiquitous and people know that this is the way you contact your legislator. This is how you have a say in the process is you can weigh in, you have a topic that animates you for one reason or another. You get an alert on an email or on your phone or whatever that says, "Hey, there's this, abortion bill that's coming up," or whatever the topic is, and you care about that, so you just jump in, you have your say, and then you go on about your life. Like, that's the level of access that we wanna create in this process.
Now that you've come out of beta testing, you've launched the platform, and you're actually actively engaged in legislative processes. But you have this issue of the will of the people versus the will of the party. And
Mhm,
even though constituents have, and I think the majority of constituents want certain things, they want safe neighborhoods, they want quality education. They want to feel that their 401ks are going to support them through their retirement. I think in
mhm,
general, most people, they want to be able to feed their families. I
right,
think there are overarching themes come out for every community, no matter what the
right,
political situation is or party
exactly,
affiliation is. But then you get to the situation where there's legislation that actually has an impact on the community. And they use the platform, and then you have a real life experience with Florida, and it doesn't match up with what the party's
right,
agenda is.
right.
Where does the power in the platform come into play for how citizens can use that, um, for leverage beyond their voting? If the politician votes against what their constituents say they actually want.
Right, I think, that's a really good point, and one of the most fascinating things that I've seen out of this process and engaging with a lot of legislators is, the some of the legislators who are big time supporters of our project and have endorsed our project, it's because they've had their own issues with the party. So, one of the Republicans who was an early adopter and endorsed this process, he was a Republican who represents, a purple district, and in down in the Keys, basically, and so he has some very rural areas of the Everglades, but he also has Key West, which is very progressive and has a big gay community. And there was famously a "Don't Say Gay" bill that came up in 2022, and he went against the party against this because he felt like it better represented his district to vote against this bill that was part of the party's platform or the party's approach. And so he took the wrath of the House leadership and ultimately they primaried him for this. They found somebody way to his right to go after him in the primary contest, and he barely won by about 100 votes, but it was a very, very close election. He spent a lot of time and energy to retain his seat, and one of the things he said was, "Look, if I had had this data during that conversation, I could have gone to the leadership and I could have said, 'Look, you can't make me take this vote. You gotta give me a pass on this because I will get skewered by my district if I vote for this bill, I'm out of office, basically. So would you rather retain this seat in the hands of a Republican, or do you need the ideological purity to force me to vote in favor of this bill right now?'" because you've got enough votes anyway. You don't need me, right? Like, so I think there are cases where having this, like, being able to diverge from the party is very difficult. Party has incredible leverage over every member, but having some concrete data to work with is very powerful. And that's normally tough for them to get. If they want to run a poll in their districts, it can be 30, 40, $50,000. And for a state legislator, they don't have that kind of campaign funds to be able to spend that money. So what we're providing them is almost like free public polling. And it's really just they need to ask their constituents to go and get engaged. So I think that that is really where we will see the power of this technology, is to give greater control back to the voters that is currently in the hands of the party apparatus and a lot of the lobbyist groups, a lot of this, the people who fund the campaigns and who push their bills through the legislators that they've effectively paid for. So we want to find a way to give a lot of that political leverage back to the voters, which they currently do not have because they've been carved out of the process through gerrymandering and primaries.
Yeah, I see the platform as a tool and a resource, one for the elected officials and also one for citizens, but not necessarily a replacement for something you just said. They need to ask their constituents to get involved. And I think that is, the data is one thing, right? Like, you can provide this for them to show to the leadership in whichever political party. But the fact that he's representing a district that he knows the demographics, he knows the makeup of their political leanings. If it's a purple district, it's because there's both progressives, right wing, left wing, everyone in between. And so that you have to have a balanced approach to how you show up as a representative, but that the job is to represent. Um, Daniel Bingham was on the last episode, and he talked about a platform that he's created, and that's beta testing, which is called Communities. And it's to create another space for people to engage in organizing and connecting with each other without being overwhelmed by the algorithms of Facebook, Instagram, X, and all the other social media platforms.
Yeah.
But he also said that people need to come together outside of these spaces. And so, as a tool and a resource for folks being able to elevate their desires for legislation, is there somehow built in, or is there a thought process within the program, the platform, to encourage people to come together and to be active and engaged outside of, you know, selecting, I don't know do they push yes, no, maybe so?
Yes. Yeah. 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 Exactly. I think we. I mean, we do the bare minimum thing on social media, which is we post to like 6 different social media platforms now. I don't even know. There's so many. We post to a bunch of platforms when new bills are posted in the system. So something's coming up for debate. It's got a committee assignment. We'll put it in our system. Meaning, I should probably clarify that. Like in Florida, and now we're expanding to other states, so it's the same way in other states. But in Florida, about 2,000 bills get drafted every legislative session. Only about between 50 and 100 will actually get a vote on the full floor of the House and Senate. So we do quite a lot of work to just triage which bills we propose we put in front of the voters to engage in. But once we put something into the system, we put it out on social media so that people can engage there as well and have that conversation. We also have some tools inside of our platform where people can discuss the bill. So we want them to be able to crowdsource their points of view. It's a project called Kialo, which is actually an educational tool where people can identify pros and cons about a piece of legislation, and they can, you know, basically put their point of view about what the bill does well and what it doesn't do well. We're actually exploring the idea, if you've heard of Polis, which is kind of a large crowdsourcing. Okay, so we're trying to provide more tools for people to have a debate about the legislation itself on our platform. We've introduced this tool called Kiala, which is kind of an educational tool where people can add pros and cons about a piece of legislation, say what they like and don't like about a bill. But we're also exploring the idea of using Polis. Polis is a large scale deliberative democracy tool to allow people to. Uh, I would love to get to the point where people could actually propose amendments to a piece of legislation that could then go to a legislator, using Polis. Or in theory, citizens could entirely draft a brand new piece of legislation, and then we take it to one of the legislators who have endorsed this project, and then they take that citizen crafted legislation and put it into the drafting process and get it a committee assignment. I think that's where we would see real participatory democracy, because part of the challenge is by the time a bill is even getting a floor vote, the so much of the debate has been whittled down to what the House or Senate leadership actually wants to talk about. And a lot of good ideas get filtered out of that process to make it to the floor in the first place. So we would like to extend community participation further and further back in the process to the point where they are actually either making changes to a bill to make it better, make a bad bill better, or entirely generating brand new ideas and turning that into legislative language, putting it into the system, getting it a vote, then we put it out on the platform so it gets widespread, mass participation. So I would love to see where maybe a citizen assembly generates a bill and then millions of voters vote on that bill that was crafted by their fellow uh, voters. I think that to me is the real dream of true civic participation.
Yeah, I like that vision and the purpose-driven implementation of the platform, because it does have that potential. If it's coupled with citizen assemblies where folks actually feel that they have ownership. Because I do think the idea, having worked in DC as a policy director, and understanding that for many people, they feel like we're being asked to vote on something after it's already been decided. And
Right.
it doesn't feel like you have any say, and you don't. I had a friend who said, you're asked to bring the flour, the eggs, the milk, the oil, the pan, because you're going to make a cake. And then when you get there, the cake's already made. So why
Right.
am I bringing all these things if you're already
Uh-huh.
making the cake? But this platform does have the potential as a tool and the resource to create space for people to be able to do the kind of civic engagement that many people
Right.
say that they want, which is that
Right.
their voices are heard, that what their needs are part of the conversation and also the decision-making process. However, that's not the system we have,
Right.
and there's this competition between what ordinary people want and then what business wants. And many people from in the US, I think this is becoming more and more a global phenomenon with democracies across the world, that it is not the interest of the citizens that is of the utmost importance, but it's of industry and business. So it's
Mhm.
industry, business, finance, and economy. And how how can a platform like this really infiltrate and penetrate through the concrete wall of business interest when it so
Right.
often becomes the most important thing that politicians think about, because that's where they get their money to run for the next election or to
Right.
pay for their new beach house if that's what they're buying with it. I'm not sure.
Exactly. No, exactly right. I mean, the system as it is, the reason that business interests have access where most people do not is because there is a high barrier to participation. There is a high information barrier. Just understanding legislation, understanding the legislative process, how a bill becomes a law. th- it's a relatively esoteric. If you actually spend as much time as I have in even understanding sort of the parliamentary procedure, you realize not a lot of it really makes sense. It's a challenging process to work through, and that's the actual policymaking part. If you look at campaigns, campaigns are the rule of thumb is whoever has the most money wins. And that's simply because of what it costs to advertise and get your name out there so that people will actually know who you are when they're in the polling booth. So both of those barriers to access mean that it takes money to get somebody elected, and it takes getting someone elected to have a influence over policy. So the business community has an incentive to do this because and leverage to do it if they have the money and they get a return on investment. And there've been a few, but I'm thinking of there was a Harvard study with, I want to say a Harvard Business School economist who determined that legislative policy lobbying is something like a 3,000% return on investment over the course of the last several decades. It's one of the highest returning ways that a business can spend its money. So writing the laws to your benefit is one of the best business practices you can invest in, which is a sad statement. So how do we resolve that problem is we have to reduce the barrier to entry and cut out a lot of the middlemen that stand between us and our representatives. And I think that this technology allows us to do it in a way that we have never been able to do in the past. The other thing that I think is really key, and we haven't talked about much, is what AI is giving us now. Because I talked about that information asymmetry problem, the fact that the legislative language is written by lawyers for lawyers. It is not designed for us to understand. It's designed for some future judge to adjudicate. And it what AI can do, what these language models can do, is basically form a translation function between esoteric legalese and normal human speech. And that's what it's giving us right now. We put the legislative text of the bill into a database where we store all the full text of the bill, thousands and thousands of pages of documents, into a database, and we put a chatbot on top of it. So if you go to our website and the bottom right, there's a little chat guy. You can talk to him about if you're looking at a bill, you can talk to him about it and ask detailed questions about what is the bill, what's in it, difference, how does it affect tax policy, how does it affect voting rights, whatever it is. And it's got the ability to rapidly read the bill and give you back an answer to your question, and also show you how legislators have voted on that bill, where it is in the bill process. So AI is giving us incredible access to this knowledge in an easily consumable way that wouldn't have been possible 5 years ago. It really is it is revolutionary in what it's able to deliver. And there's so much negativity right now around AI and generating fake content on the internet and everything. Partly because the people with bad intentions tend to move very fast, and it takes it takes good people a while to realize the threat and get to work. So, but I think that AI is just a tool. Mobile voting is a tool. It is ultimately up to us as a community to decide how we want to use these tools for the greater good and to solve the fundamental problems that we see in our democratic process.
Yeah, I think that the idea around the access to language when it comes to understanding what's being put out and an ordinary person is supposed to understand it, that AI provides for folks is really interesting and it's important, as it is also problematic because it takes up so much energy to have these data centers. So there's a lot of wonderful things that it can do, but also there's some things that we consider. And it makes me just think, if it's legalese that is so difficult, the formal language of legislation that is so difficult, why can't we make changes to it, the way it's produced? it should be language that the average person should be able to understand without having to have a law degree. Like, there are some
Right.
tweaks that we could do in our system that could make it so that people have greater access and the ability to understand what's happening to them within their governance structure. It kind of reminds me of what was it, the Dark Ages, when the only people who could read were the people that were in the church, and then they had to
Right.
recite to the people, and the people had to take them at their word, and then you're completely abused by a system that keeps you
Right.
ignorant to how it works. And with the Enlightenment was like, okay, everyone should learn how to read and write. People should know what the information is. And so if information has to be put through AI in order for people to understand what it is, then there's a problem with the system, right? There's a problem with the system that says, we're not going to make this accessible to you, because if we make it accessible to you, you would have more power. And
Yeah.
so I'm wondering about a few things. One is, how do we make social media platforms in general aren't going anywhere. We are in a technology age where it's important, it's accessible, it allows for cross sharing of information in positive ways and not so positive ways. But how do we change the system while using technology
Yeah.
that's supposed to help us engage? How do we
Yeah.
change these systems so that we can benefit from platforms like yours, but also develop a democracy that is more representative to what the people's needs are?
Well, you gave a great analogy, and I'd like to expound on that because the church in the Middle Ages, for one, the Bible was written in Latin. Um, the Bible was written in Latin. Most people didn't read, let alone speak Latin. And what the printing press did was it drastically reduced the cost of printing Bibles because the Bibles were hand scribed by monks. They were literally copied line by line, written. And so Bibles were very expensive. There weren't a lot of them. And so it was a treasured resource, and access to God meant access through your church to transcribe from this sacred document in a language that you don't understand. And so what ended up happening was the church became corrupted by that power. And Martin Luther, in 1519, he puts this 95 theses on the Wittenberg church. A lot of it was addressing that corruption. He acknowledged the systemic problem that had happened in the church because that access to power had corrupted those who held that power, and spoke to that spoke to that need for reform. But the church didn't actually excommunicate him for the 95 Theses. They excommunicated him for translating the Bible into German and printing the Bible in a language that people could understand. And that actually threatened their power, and that's why they removed him from the church and created that schism, right? So I think there's a really interesting analogy to that, where technology in the form of the printing press, as well as that translation into common vernacular, are equivalent, I think, to what we can see happening with this technology that we have now. I mean, the mobile voting means that we have a much cheaper mechanism to hear the inputs of voters, right? Which currently is bound up by paper ballots. It's a very expensive. It costs many millions of dollars to run elections. That's why we don't do it every week, right? But the it becomes incredibly cheap to do it in a way that is verifiable, to hear from people. So we're accessing that sort of latent computing power that we have in our brains that takes 4 watts of power, that we have millions of people sitting around who have an opinion on public policy and could add to the debate and could responsibly engage. And they're just sitting on the sidelines because we don't have a cheap and easy way to hear from them. So mobile voting gives us that, the equivalent of the printing press. But that translation process, AI is giving us the ability to translate from this complex language into the common vernacular. And that's an incredibly important part as well. I think that we will have the ability, because of these technologies, to completely reimagine our system of government. But the way that we get there is by electing people based on these principles. And we're now starting to see some of that happen. So if you go to our website, you see on the list of supporters of the legislators who've already endorsed our project. But I'm actually very excited about a lot of the candidates who've endorsed the project, who are now saying as part of their platform, if you elect me, I'm going to listen to voters using this technology in a way that I'm going to give you access in a way that you've never had before. We've had a gentleman go even further than that. He's running for the U.S. Congress in Florida's House District 11. He's a college professor. He teaches technology. And he said, I will completely change the job of a congressman. It will no longer be my job to decide on the legislation. It will be my job to come to you as a community, explain the legislation, give you the best information I can provide you with all the pros and cons of a given bill, and I'll give you my opinion on what I think you should do, but ultimately I'm going to let you vote in the app, and I'm going to vote the way the community tells me to vote. I mean, like, that's even further than anybody else has contemplated so far, but I do think the technology allows that kind of innovation, and we're going to need, his name is Dan Williams. You can go to his, donate on his website if you want to help him win. But we're going to need, there's 500,000 elected officials in the United States. We talk a lot about the 435 members of the U.S. House and the 100 senators, but there are a lot of people in city council races and school boards and municipal, the soil and water commissioner and all sorts of things where the technology could give them the ability to get community input, which is currently quite difficult for them to get. So I think it really does allow us to rethink the form and structure of our government in ways that we haven't been able to contemplate before.
What do you think the reimagining of the way government functions, the process, the system, what does that change? What does that bring to the future of democracy?
My hope is that it's greater accountability, greater transparency, and that people who currently feel dejected and disenfranchised will re-engage in the process and take greater ownership over their own government, the government that belongs to us, the government that works for us, and the government that speaks on our behalf. Because I think that if you look at what we're getting right now, you know, I think it's arguable on many measures to say that our government is poor. It's poorly performing. Americans would say that. Definitely people outside the United States would say, what the hell is going on in the United States? So it's pretty clear to everybody that we've got bad results from this process. So my conjecture is that I don't believe that we have bad government because we are bad people, that somehow Americans have suddenly like turned evil. That's not what's happened. What's happened is we have a bad process. We have a process with incredibly negative incentives that drive polarization and hyperpartisanship and and have been driving further and further away from its core process, which was deliberation and dialogue and consensus, so that we can find ways to manage a big and complicated society with 340 million people, all varying opinions and backgrounds and experiences. And that deliberative process is broken. It's broken because of the way that we elect our legislative leaders, and it's got to be fixed because otherwise we will never solve this problem. This is not a Democrats versus Republicans problem. This is really a systemic problem that was ultimately, I would argue, created by the two-party system and the electioneering process and the way that we run campaigns and the way that we elect people. But it can be solved by us. It is our government in the end. And we as a community have to take agency over that and take control of finding the solutions.
Thank you for that. It was really great talking with you today. And thank you for the work that you're doing. It's really important and very impressive.
Thank you so much for having me on, Tina. I really appreciate it. And thank you for helping spread the word.
I hope today's conversation gave you something to think about when it comes to the future of civic engagement and the role technology can play in shaping more responsive and accountable systems. If this episode resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. It really helps more people find these conversations. And I'd love to hear from you. What do you think about digital democracy? Would you use a platform like this to engage with legislation in real time? You can share your thoughts with me on social media or join the conversation with others who are passionate about strengthening democracy. You can always send me an email at tina@patternchangelab.com. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and remember, democracy works best when we all participate. Talk with you soon.